Chapter 10. Peter Judd. When confronted with a startling statement, Nancy usually was able to hide her surprise. This time she did not succeed. Mrs. Hemstead's greeting was too astounding. "So you found me out," she said, after a moment. "Who told you?" The old lady wagged her head. "I don't know. An anonymous note came in today's mail." From a deep pocket in her skirt, Mrs. Hemstead withdrew the folded piece of paper. She handed the note to Nancy. Bess and George crowded near her to read the message printed on it. The note was short and to the point. "Don't be fooled. The girl calling herself Irene Innsbruck is really Nancy Drew. She's a detective. Beware what you say to her, or you may get into trouble." Bess sniffed. "I hate people who write anonymous notes. Why didn't the person who wrote this come right out in the open and tell you?" "How should I know?" Mrs. Hemstead asked in a high, complaining voice. Nancy was sure of one thing. The sender of the note had done it with the express purpose of trying to frighten Mrs. Hemstead into revealing no more gossip to Nancy. But he doesn't stand a chance of succeeding, Nancy told herself with determination. She sighed and said aloud, "Well, now I suppose, Mrs. Hemstead, that you will tell this secret about my identity to Mr. Seaman?" For once, the old lady did not reply. Perhaps she was a little afraid of the warning in the note. Nancy decided that if the girls were going to learn anything further, she would have to do some bargaining with Mrs. Hemstead. Smiling, she said, "I just learned something amazing that happened in your town this morning." Instantly, the old lady leaned forward expectantly. "What was it?" she asked eagerly. The young sleuth laughed. "Oh, I can keep secrets too." Mrs. Hemstead frowned and rocked back and forth furiously for several seconds. Finally, she stopped. "I don't know whether I'll tell Mr. Seaman or not," she said flatly. "I suppose you'd like to know more about him. Well, I can't tell you much more than I already have. He's been coming here for several years. Always stops and talks to me to get the local news. I figure he's a traveling salesman." Nancy did not reveal the fact that he had a Deep River address. Because of Mrs. Hemstead's idea that he was from out of town, Nancy was sure now that Mr. Seaman had given a fictitious address when obtaining his driver's license. Could he have written the warning note to Mrs. Hemstead? Nancy wondered. The old lady went on. "The other day when Mr. Seaman came in, he said he was looking for a girl named Nancy Drew who was coming to town. He wanted to find out where she was staying." "But why?" George put in. "Nancy isn't acquainted with him." Mrs. Hemstead shrugged. "I don't know. Mr. Seaman acted as if he wanted to date you, Nancy. When you told me your name was Irene, I figured you must be another girlfriend." The elderly woman chuckled cheerfully. "I thought to myself, here's a complication. What's this all about, anyway?" "What do you mean?" Nancy countered. After another several seconds of furious rocking, Mrs. Hemstead said, "I mean, here you are, a detective, using an assumed name, and Mr. Seaman asking for you." Nancy laughed. "I suggest that you ask Mr. Seaman. After all, he inquired about me first." Before Mrs. Hemstead could do any more delving, the young sleuth said, "Girls, I'm absolutely starved. Let's go eat." She and the cousins escaped into the dining room and found a table far from the waiting room door. As they unfolded their napkins, George remarked, "Speaking of complications, this mystery gets more tangled by the minute." "I don't like the idea of that anonymous note, Nancy," said Bess. "It might mean danger to you." Nancy merely smiled. "You and George are my bodyguards. Can't you keep me from the big bad wolves? You know, Mr. Seaman might have sent that note." The cousins nodded worriedly. The three ate a light lunch, then Nancy said, "You know, we came to the Brass Kettle in the first place to see if Mrs. Hemstead knows Peter Judd. I admit I'd forgotten all about it until this moment." After the girls had paid their lunch checks, they went back to the waiting room. Mrs. Hemstead was not there, and Nancy wondered how soon she would return. George learned from the woman's daughter that she was having her midday meal and a rest in her room upstairs. "But Mother will be down in a little while," she said. "Would you like to wait?" Nancy decided to do so. The girls sat down for a few minutes, then arose and began to look at the various articles in the old-fashioned room. Nancy examined the antique map on the wall, which designated the local area as Moonstone Valley. Deep River was shown as a place with only a few houses and stores. There were 2 side streets, and at the end of one, at the river, stood a large mill. What a picturesque town this must have been, Nancy thought. At that moment, Mrs. Hemstead returned to the room and took her place in the old rocker. "Did you enjoy your lunch?" she asked. "Yes, indeed," Bess replied. "If I ate here very often, I'd put on pounds and pounds." "My daughter has established a good reputation," the elderly woman said proudly. "Folks come from miles and miles away." Nancy asked, "Did you ever hear of a man named Mr. Peter Judd?" "Indeed I have," Mrs. Hemstead replied quickly. "Queer old fellow." "Queer?" Nancy repeated. "That's what folks say. Peter Judd used to be a train conductor. Now he's retired and lives across the river in a little cottage. Won't have a soul help him. He does all his own cooking and laundry work. Has his place full of railroad posters. The dishes and silver he uses are all from railroad dining cars." The girls giggled. Encouraged by their interest, Mrs. Hemstead added, "You couldn't mistake his house. Right on the front lawn he has an enormous bell that was taken from an old-fashioned locomotive. Sometimes boys sneak in there and ring it. You can hear it clear across the river." "I'd like to see it," said Nancy. "Just where is his house?" Mrs. Hemstead said that if they went directly across the river and turned downstream for a mile, they would come to a dock with a string of railroad cars painted on the overhang. "That's his place." The girls thanked the elderly woman and said goodbye. They went at once to a boat rental service and hired a small runabout. Nancy took the wheel, and the little craft skimmed across the river. Some 200 feet from shore, she headed downstream, planning to turn in toward Mr. Judd's dock. On the way, George showed Bess Mr. Wheeler's half-submerged motorboat. Bess shuddered a bit. "You had a narrow escape," she said. "I wonder when the authorities are going to take the boat away," George mused. "I'd think it would be a hazard to other boats." Nancy chuckled. "Not so much as that rock we hit." "Nancy, who do you think kidnapped Mr. Wheeler?" Bess asked. The young sleuth had a ready answer. "The same persons who kidnapped Joanie Horton. I think they were afraid Mr. Wheeler might reopen the case, bringing a fraud to light. In fact, they may think Dad had asked Mr. Wheeler's assistance, even though he is retired." They located Peter Judd's dock and moored alongside it. As they walked up an incline to his little white cottage, they saw the retired railroad conductor working in his garden near the great engine bell. Nancy spoke to him, admiring the bell and his beautiful roses. Mr. Judd was cordial and invited the girls inside his home. They found it interesting, despite Mrs. Hemstead's remarks. And Peter Judd certainly did not seem queer. "How did you happen to know about me?" he asked. At once, Nancy told him about Mr. Wheeler, the accident, and the kidnapping. "What a low-down trick!" Mr. Judd cried, incensed. "What do you think is the reason?" "We can only guess," said Nancy. "Possibly you can help solve the riddle. Do you know why Mr. Wheeler was bringing my friend George and me here? He hinted that it had something to do with the settlement of Mrs. Horton's estate many years ago. Peter Judd was thoughtful for several seconds, as if trying to decide whether or not to tell these strange girls something he knew. Finally, he said, "I believe I do. After that young lady, Joan Horton, got all her grandmother's money, she went away. Nobody knew where. Suddenly I remembered something that had happened on my train a little over 6 months before old Mrs. Horton died. I went to Mr. Wheeler and told him about it, but he just laughed at me. But now I think maybe he has decided there was something to it." Eagerly, Nancy asked, "What is the story?" End of chapter 10.